atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Corey Nathan. Corey's been on the show a few times before. He is the host of a fantastic podcast with really the favorite title of any podcast I think I've ever seen, talking politics and religion without killing each other. What a title. Corey, it's great to have you back on the show.
It's good to be with you again, Michael. How you doing, man? I hope you're holding up okay.
Thanks so much. I'm hanging in there. And,
yeah.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about the midterm elections, and it occurred to me in sort of a flash of, I don't know if you want to call it insight, maybe not, that no matter what happens with these midterm elections, most of us are going to end up sorely disappointed. And it seemed to me that was the great sort of basis for a conversation. And Corey, I couldn't think of anyone I would rather have the conversation with than you. So if you're up for it, why don't we just jump in?
Let's jump in.
Okay.
I mean, where do you want me to start?
Well, I guess let's start maybe with kind of where we are right now and what we think is going to happen. And then from there, maybe why, in a sense, it's not going to matter a heck of a lot in a lot of ways. So, for instance, here's my view of the midterms, is that it's almost certain that Democrats are going to regain control of the House. I mean, over the last 10 midterm elections, it's a long time, the party not holding the presidency, they've gained an average of 21 seats in the House. And so I won't say a foregone conclusion, but if I had to rate it, I would say probably 85% or so chance that Democrats are going to take control of the House. And I'm wondering what you think about that prediction.
I think it's a pretty fair bet to say that the Democrats are going to take back the House, but there is one big contingency that you haven't mentioned yet, and that is, are these elections going to be fair? For the head of this administration, the chief executive currently, for all of his talk over the last 10 years now of rigged elections, he's the most likely person who's already shown us any number of steps, any number of times, whether it's through legal processes or underhanded ways, any number of ways that he's actually trying to steal elections. So that's what I worry about. And it can happen in any number of ways. Some that are being talked about, whether it's the presence of ICE officers around polling places, or some other means that we can't anticipate just yet. He's tried to do it through executive orders, a couple different stabs. The latest one being trying to nationalize, elections, demanding from states that they turn over voter rolls, and doing other things to try to seize control from the constitutional process that states regulate their own elections. So that's my biggest concern. And listen, I'm a right of center. Like in normal times, I'm considered a conservative, especially fiscal conservative. In normal times, I'm like a Paul Ryan type of, Jack Kemp type of, Alex P. Keaton type of conservative. But because I see the words and actions of Donald Trump on a daily basis, and it sears my conscience as a Christian, that because of that, I get labeled as a liberal. But that's neither here nor there. What I am most concerned about is the security of the elections. If we have something that looks like the specials that we've seen in 2025 and early 2026, then yeah, absolutely right. I don't think it's out of the question to see 25, 30 or more seats go in favor of Democrats in the House. And I don't think it's out of the question. The states that I'm looking at in the Senate are Florida and Texas, in particular because the Democrats have really strong candidates, Alex Vindman in Florida and James Talarico in Texas. I am going to avoid smoking the hopium, but if those races prove to be really, really close, things then are. This is the year, and these are the candidates. These are the circumstances where maybe one, if not both of those, can go Democrats' way. So that's a lot. So sorry, sorry to filibuster.
I certainly understand your concerns about election integrity. And on the Senate, I have a similar, well, I won't say necessarily all that similar, but I do think that there's an outside shot at this point that the Democrats could take the Senate. I mean, they need to hold Michigan, they need to hold Georgia. Those aren't clear holds, but they do have potential pickups in North Carolina and Maine, possibly Ohio, possibly Alaska. And I would say Texas is maybe a long shot, but then again, if Ken Paxton ends up winning that Republican primary in May, then I could maybe see Texas, although, again, that might be a hopium kind of thing for some Democrat. But the point being is that all of a sudden, it's not out of the question to see Democrats take the House and even possibly have a 51-49 margin in the Senate. Now, that's probably best case scenario for Democrats, but I don't think it's crazy talk at this point.
It's not crazy talk because if you look at the specials, for example, the gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey, best case scenarios were 7 or 8 point victory, right? Turns out in New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill won by 14 points, I think. Same thing in Virginia. Best case scenario, Abigail Spanberger outpaced best case scenarios by at least a couple of points. I think she was upwards of 14, 15 points, right? So these special elections, if these special elections are any indicator, I don't think it's out of the question. To your point, North Carolina is probably the Democrats' best chance of a pickup. I'm not until Maine goes the way of a Democrat. I'm not buying that. I'm not buying that bridge just yet. Alaska, I would give more credence to than Maine, but that's just a spidey sense. I would defer to somebody like Mike Madrid and see if he's seeing any numbers that are indicating something different. So those are some of the ones that I'm seeing right now. But yeah, the Senate's not out of the question. I wouldn't say it's a 50-50 jump ball, but it's greater than zero, maybe 20 or 30% chance that the Democrats get that 51 seat margin.
And before I make the argument that mostly we're going to be disappointed, even if you're a Democrat and that best case scenario happens, I thought first I'd say, well, it's not inconsequential. There will be some important changes if Democrats win one or both chambers. For instance, all of a sudden, Democrats will be able to run investigations with majority staff, with majority resources, and with the ability to issue subpoenas. And that's important. And we are going to see if that happens, and I expect it will, at least in the House, a whole bunch of investigations. I'm sure you expect the same thing.
I would love to see investigations because all across the executive branch and into the military, they've basically stripped any sense of accountability, watchdogs and internal accountability. So even if it's a House conducting investigation, a House committee conducting investigations, I'm here for it. The question I have is, are they able to do the work, or is it going to be kabuki theater? If they pull a Kash Patel, for example, in front of a committee, that's just not something I want to see. He's going to do a song and dance and throw a temper tantrum and puff out his chest. And, he's going to act like a 6-year-old playing a video game in a Senate committee or a House committee. So that's not something I'm interested in seeing. I don't think it's particularly productive. But if they can actually get work done and start acting like Article 1 lays out for the job of Congress, then yeah, I'm here for it. Again, even though I'm not a Democrat, I want proper constitutional order back in place, as well as accountability for an administration that's not just pushing back against the Constitution. They're anti-Constitution, and we've seen it in any number of ways.
Yeah, well, I think what both of us are is rule of law guys, and what we're seeing is a lot of not that, and the idea of some kind of a return to accountability and a rule of law seems like a really good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. A rule of law constitution. I mean, the Constitution, listen, It was our friends, who were part of the Tea Party 10, 15 years ago that were carrying around constitutions in their jacket pocket. I don't know if some of those friends still remember it. Guys like Joe Walsh, who's still a conservative, but ultimately became an independent and now is a Democrat as a conservative. Guys like that remember it. Kinzinger remembers it. Liz Cheney remembers it. But I think there's a lot of guys who just cognitive dissonance. The Constitution isn't written in some mysterious, lost, ancient language. The Constitution is written in plain language. And you don't have any given day, an action is taken by this administration that goes in direct opposition to the plain language of the Constitution. So, the law is fascinating to me. But when we stand up and do the pledge, we're not pledging to the flag. We're pledging to what the flag represents. And it's the republic for which it stands, the Constitution. So that's what I didn't realize how passionate I was about it until every single day of this. And in particular, this term, we're seeing it abused and strained beyond what I think it can bear.
Yeah. And I think also a big change will be that if Democrats end up with the House or the Senate, that means that President Trump's going to have to work with at least some Democrats to pass a budget and also to increase the debt ceiling, because that deal that was made in 23, I believe, will run out in 2027. And so that's an even more substantive sort of thing. And I'm very curious to see how that's going to work, because so far I haven't seen much of a indication of a willingness of President Trump to really work with anyone who doesn't already agree with him.
Yeah, I'm not buying stock in that, in that possibility that Trump would work with Democrats in Congress. The reason is that if he's shown anything in terms of his MO, it's ratings. It's, tactical, but only one step of tactics, right? It's clear, for example, with the Iran war, he thought about, what can I do to distract from the Epstein files? I'll drop some bombs. I'll go, kidnap
Maduro, yeah.
Is it the prime minister in Venezuela? Forgive me for being
president, I believe. Yeah, Maduro, right? Absolutely.
Maduro.
Yeah.
So I'll go kidnap Maduro, and to that extent, he's successfully distracted the headlines from talking about Epstein. But he thought, I'm going to look like a hero. I'm going to look like Rambo and Rocky and General Patton all wrapped up into one, if he even knows who General Patton is. But what he didn't do was he didn't read page 2. Okay, you bomb the crap out of Iran, and God forbid something happens terrible tonight where, as he's been warning, where he commits war crimes and knocks out the electrical grid and 90 million citizens who have nothing to do with the Ayatollah and the regime are suddenly back in the Stone Ages in Trump's words. Yeah. God forbid something like that actually happens. But the point is, he didn't. We're sitting here with in California, it's $6 a gallon gas. And it was expensive enough. And I have my issues with the administration and legislature here in California, but it's not their fault it's $6 a gallon gas. It's the Strait of Hormuz is closed because, again, Trump didn't read page 2. There's a reason that all of these administrations, Republican and Democrat, haven't taken the steps that he's taken. It looks great for the headlines. It looks great, again, for the distraction from the Epstein files for his purposes, but it doesn't look great for the rest of the world. The rest of the world that has to clean up this mess, for him lurching about looking for a next headline. So the idea that he might work with Congress, I don't think that's what he's looking for. Yeah. I think he's looking for a distraction. He's looking for ratings. He's looking for the next big headline and to win the news cycle. And then to have enough people around him telling him he's the greatest president and the greatest person and probably a messiah. Many people are saying, they've been waiting for the Messiah, and many people are saying that's me. I didn't say it. It's
right.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think going back to control of the Senate in particular, why a lot of Democrats, I think, are excited about that at least possibility, even if it's not more than even odds, is that, that all of a sudden changes the appointments calculus in the Senate, right? But one thing I would point out on that is, even if, and I think no one no one except for a delusional person thinks that Democrats are going to end up with more than, say, probably 51 Senate seats. But even then, you got to contend with what I'll call the Fetterman situation, right? Because John Fetterman voted for Kristi Noem, Scott Bessent, Pam Bondi, Mark Wayne Mullen. I mean, John Fetterman, in some ways, while he votes with Democrats 80-something% of the time on appointments, it could actually not make as much of a difference as people think, depending on what John Fetterman decides to do.
So I embrace that possibility. And I think you have a really good point that if the Democrats even bring it to 50-50, I know that Vance would make the deciding vote if you assume that all Democrats vote one way and all Republicans vote another way. But I love the idea that if it's that closely held, that certain senators would have to be persuaded to cast an independent vote here and there. I really embrace that possibility, whether it's Fetterman as a Democrat casting a vote that goes against his party, or you get Senator from Maine. Forgive me, I forgot her name off the top of my head.
Collins, right?
Senator Collins from Maine, or Senator from Alaska, Senator from North Carolina currently. The idea that within the Senate, supposedly the deliberative body, that certain senators would cast an independent vote, that's a good thing. That means that the institution is working the way it should. And again, whether it's one way or the other, I'm more interested in the institution working and functioning. So if Democrats do indeed take that 51 seat majority, great. It means that Trump won't be able to nominate someone like the Judge Cannon in Florida as his next Supreme Court pick. Or, maybe it means that Alito and Thomas have to hang on for another couple of years, and if a Democrat wins presidency in 2028, then I embrace that possibility, or maybe, to your point earlier, that Trump will actually have to find a judge more along the lines of the three justices he appointed in the first term, who are all, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett,
yep,
are all proving to be. If you read their opinions, they're not MAGA judges. They're McConnell judges, maybe, but their opinions are really nuanced. And they're actually proving to be quite a bulwark against the authoritarian tendencies of this administration. There have been a couple of decisions that I strongly disagreed with, in particular the presidential immunity case. But but for the most part, we're seeing the Supreme Court and the judicial system, that branch of government, functioning in a way that it was meant to. Even if you oppose some of their positions, if you actually read their opinions, it's a very nuanced, a conservative, but a pre-MAGA conservative judicial philosophy.
Yeah. And you know what? Of course, my primary argument here is that no matter what happens, most people are going to end up being disappointed. Now, there are going to be rooters, right? That the strong partisans, of course, they want to see their side in charge, but most Americans aren't like that. And in fact, most Americans think that Congress is pretty darn awful. And one of the things we know for sure is that no matter which party ends up in control at the end of the midterms, most of the players, the vast majority, are going to stay the same. I mean, right now, Cook Political Report says that only 4% of House races are toss-ups and only 11% of Senate races. So pretty much we're going to be seeing essentially the same cast. So if you don't like these guys as a collective, or these people as a collective, they're mostly guys, well, not a heck of a lot is going to change. And what do you think about, I mean, you obviously know that most of our congressional races are incredibly uncompetitive. Do you see that as a problem?
I do, absolutely. I was opposed to Prop 50 here in California, the mid-decade redistricting proposition. I had the luxury of opposing it because I had a feeling it would win by a large margin, which it ultimately did. But I disagreed with it on principle, even though I understood the argument you got to fight fire, with Texas succumbing to Trump's will and doing this mid-decade redistricting, that California has to fight fire with fire. I understand the logic, but I disagree with it in principle. We had a really strong democratic renovation, that being the independent commissions that set the House congressional districts, and I think that was an excellent democratic renovation, which resulted in my district, or my former district now, California 27, being purplest of purple. Mike Garcia, the first time he won that seat in 2020, well, actually, that was after the special election, but his first full term, he won by 333 votes out of almost 350,000 that were cast. So that's 1/10 of 1%. Yeah. And there were similarly close races in 22, and then George Whitesides won a pretty close race in 24. I've just been drawn out of California 27. I'm half a mile on the other side of a line where I'm now represented by somebody who's 60 miles, 70 miles away. Nothing against the folks in Oxnard, California. I just don't know any of them, and they're not my neighbors. Yeah. I'd rather be in a district with my neighbors in this, especially in this purple district. So I was opposed to that. But here's a question. And again, I should check with somebody like Ron Steslow, who started out part of his political career drawing lines and pushing for redistricting on the Republican side of the aisle. I think in around 2010. I should check with him about this. But I'm wondering, or also with people who watch where populations are moving. Since the pandemic, there's been a lot more folks who move around the country and around the state because a lot of jobs allow them to do that. Somebody whose work maybe was based here in L.A., part of the entertainment industry, there's a significant percentage of folks who've been able to move out of state. So I'm wondering if that is going to affect the dark, deep red nature, deep blue nature of certain districts. It's affecting the state of Texas, for example. A lot of folks moved to Austin and other cities in Texas from California that were very left-leaning. It has an additive effect, not just in 1 year, but over the course of a decade or so. It can change certain districts and even certain states. Yeah.
When I think about the sort of people we have in Congress, I know that I guess the default is to think in terms of personalities, but as a political scientist, as an institutionalist, I tend to think in terms of, well, what are the systems that give us these people? And to me, a big part of the picture and a big part of the problem, honestly, is we have these low turnout primaries that essentially structurally favor more extreme candidates. And so by the time you get to a general election, you have folks who aren't those extremists saying, well, crap, I don't like this person, but I don't like this person either. So which is the least bad alternative? And for me, that's not a very good system.
Yeah, that's why I do like the open primary process here in California. You end up with two top candidates, and sometimes it's two Republicans, sometimes it's two Democrats. But what you also end up with, especially as California 27 was drawn before, was often you end up with candidates that I'm not going to call them moderate, because Mike Garcia wasn't moderate. He sort of I had the privilege of having the conversation with him, how deeply I disagreed with his votes on January 6th and January 7th to overturn the elections of Arizona and Pennsylvania. But there were other moments where he represented the purple district that we were. He took some independent votes that I really appreciated, not because those votes were in agreement with how I felt about that particular piece of legislation, but he had to, and Christy Smith, who ran against him 3 times, they had to appeal to others that were, in Christy's case, right of center, in Mike's case, left of center. When you can truly represent your whole constituency and not just the radical fringe, that's a good thing for democracy. That's a good thing for the constitutional order, like we were talking about before.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think a part of the problem is it's not just the primaries, but of course, fundraising incentives, digital media incentives, they also going to structurally favor candidates who are much more conflictual, much more negative, because we know those are the sort of things that drive those dollars, and especially those small dollar donations.
Have you heard of any reforms? Just to give you one, I heard somebody, I forget if it was in Danielle Allen's program. She deals with democracy renovation quite a bit. She's taken quite a lead on that. I forget if it was her program or something else, where somebody said they weren't talking about restricting fundraising except within regions. So you can raise funds and small dollar donations, but only in the state that you're running. In the case of especially state legislatures or Senate and House within the state that they're representing. But have you heard of any other renovations that can address that the problem that you just raised?
I mean, I've heard of a bunch of things. I think the fundamental problem is the Supreme Court's view of the First Amendment and how it relates to campaign finance. And so almost anything, well, a lot of things that folks talk about essentially will end up running right up against that and being, I think, very problematic given the Supreme Court's interpretation of that. So I think it would be really difficult for anything like that to stick for any length of time, is my sense.
I wonder if it can go through the legal system and ultimately, whether it's next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there's another case that can challenge some of these poorly made decisions. I mean, it was a 40 or 50 year crusade to overturn Roe. A lot of folks saw that as a poorly written decision. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg had some intelligent critiques against how that was written. But there have been others historically that were just bad decisions that it just took time for them to be overturned. So I wonder if there are certain cases that can be brought that can address campaign financing, for example.
I don't think so, and here's why. I think when the examples you gave, Roe and abortion, or Dred Scott and things about slavery and so forth, I think those are issues that people, regular, normal people, not like politically weird people like us, just inherently get, and they really grab you. But campaign finance is what I would call a plumbing issue. People don't really care about the plumbing until, the shit backs up, right? And so, and so I just don't see, and that's generally the problem with a lot of moves for institutional incentive reforms, is that they're just not very exciting. They seem really dull, and it's hard to build up any sort of a strong coalition. When you talk about something like human freedom or killing babies or whatever, a woman's right to choose, those are really visceral, emotional things. But saying, well, do you think that money should be regulated to out of state? It's like, oh my God, wake me up when you're over, dude,
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I'd love to dress it up as sexy. Somehow figure out how to find the catchphrase to make it sexy.
Yeah, that would be
election. Democratic renovation is a good start, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. But I think, another problem is people hear these candidates talk about how they're going to change things or how things will change if our party's in the majority, that sort of thing. But one of the things we know for sure, again, aside from most of the players are going to stay the same, 90% plus, is that institutional rules in Congress almost always work against change. For instance, a single member just can't accomplish much because you need majorities at least, and the Senate filibuster is not going away anytime soon. And neither Democrats will not have a veto-proof majority. There's not going to be a filibuster-proof majority. And so what we know in terms of legislation is that the deadlock, the gridlock is not going to magically just go away. We have gridlock for the foreseeable future.
But I do think that strong minorities can assert a great deal of influence. And we've seen that. Whether it's like I mentioned the Tea Party earlier, there was a faction of Congress. It was a minority. Maybe it was the majority of one of the parties, but it was still a minority within Congress that was able to get a lot done. The Freedom Caucus now is another example. Now, granted, their party is in the majority right now, so a minority within the majority is able to make a lot of noise. But on the Democratic side, the Progressive Caucus within the Democratic side of the House is making a lot of noise and having a lot of influence, or more formal caucuses like the Congressional Black Caucus. The one that I'm rooting for is the Problem Solvers Caucus. They're, I guess, moderate sort of by definition in that they're definitionally inclusive of Democrats and Republicans, but I want them to be extreme moderates. I want not extreme in how moderate they're legislating, but in their ability to work together. When they're able to work together and be radical, seemingly or comparatively to how things have been going today, I want Brian Fitzpatrick and whoever's his compatriot is to make a lot of noise and say, hey, we can find things to work on together. One of my favorite moments was about a year ago. George Whitesides was here in the district. There was a big fundraiser for cancer research. What was it called? Wine or Taste of the Town, which we do every year. And George was back in the district, and one of our city council members. Technically, you have to be independent or undeclared to be part of our city council, but he's a Republican. In fact, the fellow I'm thinking of, Jason Gibbs, is actually running against George in the next election for this House seat. And he's pretty ruby red, Jason is. But I was privy to a conversation they were having about funds that George was trying to secure for our district to help rebuild. It's called the Old Road. It's literally, that's what it's called. But it's a road that runs through the entire Santa Clarita Valley. So the idea that there's something, build the damn roads was, I think, Gretchen Whitmer's expression, right? And those are my favorite governors. Those are my favorite legislators. When you could just just build the damn roads. Yeah. And that's something, whether you disagree on how to get there, you can at least agree on the goal to build some damn roads, right? So there's got to be something, and I'm really rooting for the Problem Solvers Caucus to be the loudest caucus in the entire Congress.
Well, I think part of the problem is we talked about that the sort of structural incentives work against moderates in a lot of ways getting elected in the first place. But then there's another factor that I think often is unappreciated, especially to people who aren't, well, I guess old like me and have been around for forever. But this idea that Congress is a lot more competitive. And when you get more competition, there's actually less incentive to compromise. What I mean is that, for instance, prior to the mid-1990s, there really wasn't a high probability that control of one or both chambers would switch much. I mean, Democrats controlled the Senate for all but 10 years from the early 30s until the mid-90s, and they controlled the House for all but 4 years during that same period. So if you're a Republican, you don't have any realistic chance most of those times of being in charge. And so all of a sudden, getting half a loaf seems reasonable. But since that kind of Gingrich revolution in 94, well, Republicans have controlled the House 22 of the last 32 years, the Senate 20 of the last 32 years. And so it's become a much more closely fought thing. And that means both parties say, well, listen, yeah, I could get some of what I want working with the other side, but why don't we just demonize the other side, win a majority in the next election, and get even more of what we want? And of course, with both parties thinking that way, that makes it much more difficult to try to work out compromises and work with the other side.
Yeah. I don't know how to begin to fight against that. We've talked about some Democratic renovations like open primaries, ranked choice voting, things like that. But I don't know how to change the incentive structure. It seems like, pissing in the wind, man. Like there are so many institutional structural problems that incentivize sitting members of Congress to go for more clicks and more likes and more tweets and more, it's the wrong incentive structure. It's, broadcast networks trying to get a hit on Fox News, trying to get clicks on Twitter or Trump Social, it seems that a lot of Congress members are thinking in those terms, and that's their scoreboard that they're looking for, as opposed to co-authoring legislation to build the damn roads.
Yeah. They're influencers who happen to be in Congress, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and again, I don't know, man. I don't even know where to begin. Maybe it is the Democratic renovations. Maybe that's a place to start, because you can't. There isn't necessarily. Is there legislation that can change the incentive structures of social media companies, for example. Other countries have tried it with some varying levels of degrees of success, but I don't know. It just seems like a big mountain, man. And
well, I think one of the problems when we talk about institutional change and changing incentive structures is, of course, for this to happen with Congress would have to do that. But by the same token, those people who are sitting in Congress who would be doing that are folks who have benefited, who have learned how to play the particular game with these structures. And so you got to say, well, what is their incentive to change the incentive structure of a system that has favored them? That becomes a really tricky problem.
So I'm going to contradict myself seemingly here, because I do see what I call green shoots, a promise of at least the possibility of a brighter future. And where I see that is at the local and state level. I described a situation where, Congressman George Whitesides was collaborating and cooperating with Jason Gibbs on a local project. That's one sign. But I'm also seeing it at the state legislature. Suzette Valadares is a Republican who's our state senator here in our district. Those districts haven't changed. And she's in the super minority here. The California state legislature is dominated by Democrats. So by nature, she's had to find ways to cooperate with her Democratic colleagues. But she has willing partners on the Democratic side. So that's where I see some hope, as opposed to every Democrat in the California state legislature just identifying Republicans as the enemy and declaring war and never wanting to cooperate on anything with them. So Suzette has willing partners on the Democratic side. That's a sign of hope. And if you look around the country, I think that state legislatures and local local elected officials, you'll see a lot more folks at that level who are our future U.S. House representatives, our future senators, our future president, perhaps, is coming from that crop of state legislators and local legislators.
Well, it sounds like you're at least somewhat more hopeful than I am, and I guess that's a good thing. I guess I will say that I'm not entirely hopeless, at least on my good days. I'm not entirely hopeless because I've been thinking about ways that elections could be less disappointing. And I agree with you about the state and local. There's a lot more good stuff, I think, potentially happening there than in Congress, where I honestly don't see much good happening at all. But that said, I think there are some ways that congressional elections could be less disappointing. I mean, for instance, one thing that could potentially happen is there could be a wave election that gives one party a filibuster-proof trifecta. I mean, it's happened before. It happened in 2009, 2010. There was this 6 to 7 month window where the Democrats had the presidency, 60 seats in the Senate, and a majority in the House. And the result of that was the Affordable Care Act. I would argue the most consequential domestic legislation of the last probably several generations, as well as the Dodd-Frank financial legislation. And so that's not out of the question, though. It's sort of difficult to envision when you start looking at the map to try to see how either party can get the 60 in the Senate these days.
Yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon, unless those people moving is more of a thing, what I mentioned before. But just so you have it, I was talking about state legislators. There's a great organization called Future Caucus. They particularly study legislators of Gen Z and millennial generations. They're seeing a lot more of this cross-partisan collaboration. So there are some good studies there if you wanted to look those guys up. Cool. But I don't want to. Gosh, you're like convincing, you're persuading me to be hopeless, and I just don't want to go in that direction.
Well, that's what happens when you've been a political scientist for 20 plus years. I guess you start to, I don't know, get all jaded. But okay, I agree that probably is not going to happen, because the last time before that weird little window in 2009, 2010, where we saw anything like that was the late 1970s. So that's pretty rare, right?
Yeah.
But another thing that could possibly happen, we know the Senate is not going to end the filibuster full stop, because honestly, if the Republican majority was not willing to do it for Donald Trump, it's just not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think something that could possibly happen is weakening the filibuster. For instance, I could see the possibility of votes for the filibuster not to apply to things like the budget or the debt ceiling, or stretching it more, voting or election administration legislation, or maybe even national security legislation, that sort of thing. That to me is possibly not a bridge too far and could at least lessen some of that logjam for better or for worse, I suppose.
Right. So I see two things happening at the same time. One is the emergence of more and more elected officials who have a philosophy that can be best described as an own the libs philosophy. And that's it. That's what drives it. I think what ultimately sank Governor, DeSantis in Florida is that a lot of his legislation was not conservative. He emerged as a very thoughtful, conservative political thinker, but a lot of the legislation that he was pushing was just an own the libs legislation. It was anti-conservative, a lot of what he ended up doing. So that's on one side. And I don't think it's out of the question to see more leaders in the Senate and the House with that type of philosophy. What governs them isn't a coherent political philosophy or an ethical philosophy. It's an own the libs philosophy. It's an us versus them, Carl Schmitt type of philosophy. At the same time, I do see the counter to that, and that is if elections, the midterms, go in the direction that we've seen special elections and the 2025 elections that we saw, if they continue to go in that direction, I do think that certain Republicans, not all, probably a small minority, are going to find their voice, are going to find their courage. So you're going to see that it's in their best interest to look like an independent, to look like an old school conservative, to look like a neocon even, because it's in their best interest in their particular state, like a North Carolina, for example, or in their particular district, looking like they're pushing back against Trump, who's now the institution, who's now the old guard, right? 10 years in, he's now the old guard. So for certain Republicans, and the current senator in North Carolina is finding his voice in that regard too. I think you're going to see a handful of Congress members on the Republican side, maybe a small handful of senators on the Republican side. If it's a wave election, I think you're going to some Republicans are going to be finding their courage.
It would be interesting to see that, I guess. But yeah, another thing I thought of that might possibly happen is. Right now, basically any major legislation that gets passed because of this gridlock passes through the reconciliation process.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the OBBB under Trump, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act under Biden. I'm speaking in acronyms here. God, I can't do that. But the key thing here is that under what's called the Byrd Rule, named for former West Virginia Senator Byrd, provisions in budget reconciliation have to primarily affect the budget. And this is a call that's made by the Senate parliamentarian. And since 2012, this has been the same person named Elizabeth McDonough. And now I could see a situation where, for instance, the parliamentarian serves at the pleasure of the majority leader. That's who gets to pick that person. And so there's nothing that prevents John Thune or whoever might end up being majority leader after John Thune to say, you know what, Liz, it's been a great run for you. You've been in the job a while, and replacing her with someone who's much more agenda friendly, I guess. And I could certainly see that. Now, of course, a more nuclear option is the parliamentarian makes her ruling and the majority in the Senate votes against that ruling. And then that becomes, well, it's perfectly okay to do this. And there's nothing that would prevent that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, I could absolutely see that. I mean, the Trump and the administration are pushing back on parts of the executive branch and going even into Congress that we thought that there would be a separation. Obviously, we've seen it with the Justice Department, which is now seemingly ironically named. We've seen it with the Fed, him pushing back on Powell, suing Jerome Powell. We've seen it in all kinds of ways, so I wouldn't be surprised if someone brought this to his attention and he started pushing on Thune to go in that direction. That wouldn't surprise me at all. He's tried to break every other part of our, the institutional framework and integrity of what makes the the country run, basically. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that happening as well.
But I guess I think what's most likely, it's always dangerous to say, well, the current trends will continue indefinitely. That's the easiest prediction to make. But it seems to me the path of least resistance is essentially governance by executive order, assuming Congress is not going to do a lot or provide a lot of resistance, and just letting the executive branch and administrative agencies run things with occasional, chirpings in from the courts. You can't do this. And Congress is essentially just does not a hell of a lot except for passing a budget every once in a while, and they can't even manage to do that.
At a certain point, Congress is going to get the message. If you've read some of the opinions coming out of Supreme Court, especially this Gorsuch just wrote one in the tariffs case where a lot of he was actually critiquing his colleagues in the Supreme Court one by one, but a lot of the subtext of what he was writing was Congress, do your job. So at a certain point, somebody's going to get that message, and Congress is going to do its job to the extent that they can. If it's a Democratic-controlled House, then you talked about congressional committees and investigations. They're going to find, just as Trump has been finding holes in the dam and leaks in the dam of institutional, constitutional order. Congress is going. I maybe again hopium. Congress is going to get the message, and eventually somebody's going to figure out that somebody's got to do their job.
I see that logic, but then I think, well, how would this work in practice? And so I can see individual members making this case, but it seems to me that the sort of institutional inertia is so strong and responsibility is so fragmented that it's just politically easier and maybe even more rational for most individual members of Congress to not actually push for changes, even if they would help the country, because oftentimes what's good for the country and what's good for the political fortunes of individual members of Congress are very different sort of things. And so I guess in the end, I feel like absent a really severe external shock, and I mean something like, I don't know, another major terrorist attack, a successful one, China maybe invading Taiwan. I don't even know if that would do it. It's just hard for me to see the mechanics of how Congress would come out of what I see as almost sort of a, I don't want to call it a death spiral, maybe a relevant spiral. I don't know, maybe a combination of both.
Yeah. So David Brooks and Mona Charen both reminded it. Mona was in a panel discussion, and David wrote it in one of his recent pieces in the Atlantic of what conservatism looks like. Again, it's not as sexy as stop the steal or defund the police. It's more along the lines of let's get modest pieces of legislation and then another one gradually over time. That doesn't look good on a placard that you're in a protest about. But that's really what it's supposed to be. Pieces of legislation that move the needle a little bit gradually over time. So I think that's something that maybe by nature, a lot of folks are frustrated because whatever piece of legislation or leader that the person is passionately supporting, they want to be able to snap their fingers and change the whole world. But I find in the work that I do, the civic renewal space, that it's one conversation. And even in one conversation at a time, I'm not changing somebody's opinion by 180 degrees nor vice versa. They're changing my opinion, but I have 1 degree of influence. 1 degree maybe of persuasion, but it's one conversation, one person at a time, and I'd love to see it. Not that I don't want to see ambitious legislation, but I want to see ambition in faithfulness to the constitutional process, to maybe at the end of the day, maybe I am an institutionalist, but I believe in the brilliance of the Constitution. If you do nothing else, just read the First Amendment a few times. It'll take you no time. It's plain language, but it's one of the most brilliant sentences that was ever written in the English language. And man, it's a beautifully constructed document. The First Amendment alone, but the entire document is just absolutely brilliant. And that's what I want to see manifested. What the founders, it's like a promise that the founders gave to future generations, and one that we recommit to every single day, if not every single year, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, and I think in the end, even though I've been very cynical, I suppose, and hopeless almost about it, in the end, I wouldn't be doing what I do. I know you wouldn't be doing what you do if we didn't believe that it would make some sort of difference, because we're certainly not doing it for the riches and fame of indie podcasting, right? Because we believe in having one conversation at a time, or, getting people to talk and hoping they talk to other folks. And if change is going to happen, I think that maybe is the way I feel like it could, and that maybe we could be a part of that change, and why what we do matters. I'd like to think it does. Let's hope it does, right?
Let's hope it does. You just remind me. I got a note from a pastor from a church I used to go to over the weekend. And there was a lot that he said that I strongly disagree with. But there was one that really pissed me off, because it's so the cognitive dissonance that it took for him to say that the work that I do is focused on building an audience. I'm trying to, I'm saying things and doing things to win an audience. And it's like the exact opposite. So if I really wanted to do, you and I know how to do it. We know, and we've read those studies that anger and fear and hatred, these are all like emotional and mental crack cocaine, right? And we could get audiences addicted to it. So the work that I do is like, here's some broccoli, a little cauliflower.
Exactly.
I'm like, David, have you been paying attention?
Yeah.
Like, I could go that, the Matt Walsh direction. I chose to go the cauliflower direction.
I love that. We're like the people with the little broccoli booth in the candy store or something. That's great, man.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, well. On that note, with that very vivid image, I think that's a great place to close. Folks, I hope you enjoyed your dose of broccoli here. Maybe we put a little Velveeta on it to make it more appealing.
There you go.
I don't know.
Because, the cauliflower doesn't give you enough gas, right?
There you go. Corey, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And again, folks, if you haven't checked out Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, do yourself a favor and search for it in your podcast app. I'll also make sure I put a link in the show notes.
Awesome. Michael, this is so much fun, man. We got to do this more often.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Corey. Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you have a question or comment for us, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. If you're not already a supporter of the show, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Supporters get ad-free versions of everything we release, our full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview, and access to our Politics Guys Discord group. It's a fun place with a great bunch of people. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. And if Patreon isn't your thing, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, you can support us on PayPal and Venmo too. You'll find links to all our support options at politicsguys.com/support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email me. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,